Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our latest webinar, this time on office or home working, what employees want now and how it's changed. I am Mark Drew. I'm the Managing Director of Cogito. We're a people insights business who work with HR people like you to help them help their companies learn more about employees, candidates, brand, competitors, and market. We're all about sharing insight and evidence to help people like you to support your colleagues. We shape our research surveys, polls, and white papers on the topics that our, I think, hub community and our wider HR network want to know more about, so that they can better support their business. And perhaps unsurprisingly, home working versus office working is high on people's list. And it's why you're here today. We're all thinking about it, it seems. It's in the media regularly. And we're, I think, all in a position now where we're either adjusting to being back in the office. I'm in our Bristol office today, planning to return or waiting to establish what's going to happen in the future for us and our colleagues. It just seems that we're adapting to yet another new norm. And amongst the things that our HR network tell us are some of the things that they're looking at the moment, which is how many days do people want to work in the office or at home each week, and how can we accommodate this? And even can we accommodate this for those who want it? How do we move from workspaces to collaboration spaces, and what does that mean? What do we want people to do when they're in the office? I think importantly, what do our employees expect and want from us moving forward? We've recently seen challenges for some of our customers as they look to recruit for positions which are fully home-based roles and fully office-based roles, as they find that some people don't want one or the other. So what do we do? Well, I think depending on our roles in our business, our company, maybe even the relationship we have with our boss, we may have a different working setup to the one that we had before. And many of us are anticipating a greater level of flexibility in where and when we work. Last autumn, we conducted research to discover what people felt about working from home and the office, what they wanted in the future, what they liked and what they didn't like. 6 months on, we were keen to know more. Have things changed? As we've all spent more time working from the bedroom, kitchen, or home office, if we're lucky enough to have one, did we feel that this was what we wanted more of? Or did we miss our colleagues, the commute, and did we want to get back to more of a social setting? And then what expectations do we now have upon our employers as they support, fund, and enable home and office working? So this session is about sharing our insights with you, helping you understand what people feel now and what, if anything, has changed from our previous work. I'm going to hand over to Rory Fangman, who is our solutions lead for People Insights, and Rory will take you through our initial findings. I'll rejoin at the end for the Q&A session. Rory.
Hi, so my name is Rory Fangman. I'm the solutions lead for data and insight at Cogito. So essentially, I look after all the research projects at Cogito and the data-led parts of our programs. So that's things like competitor research, skills research, essentially anything on the organizational research side of things comes under my remit. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to share some of the research that we've carried out over the last 6 months into office and home working practices. We're also putting together, just a scene. Sorry, bear with me for one moment. Sorry, I'm having screen sharing problems. Right, that should be better. So where were we? Yeah, so we're going to, so the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to share some of the research we've been carrying out over the last 6 months into office and home working practices. We're also going to put all of that together in a more in-depth white paper about the data that we've collected, and that will be segmented by age, gender, location, etc. And we'll also be able to give all of you early access to that white paper before we publish it. So in this session, there is also a question function on the right-hand side of your screens. So if you do have any questions as we go through them, feel free to pop them in there, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end. We'll also share with you the copy of the slide deck that we've used, so you can all digest it at your own leisure. So throughout the last, 6 months, we've been conducting research about the changes in the way home working is being used by employers and received by employees. So throughout that period, we've surveyed 470 individuals to gain their views on home working. This has been done in 2 cohorts, so one in autumn last year and one in spring 2021. And we wanted to understand last year what people really wanted at the return from the first lockdown, and then again, what people really wanted at the point of return from the second lockdown as we return to normal. And then, of course, we also kind of wanted to understand how that had changed in between those 2 time periods. So in autumn 2020, we also surveyed a number of employers to get their views on home working and how it had impacted them. So today, that's the data that we're going to run through. I think the first thing to note is the scale of change that the pandemic has brought about in terms of working practices. So according to the Office of National Statistics, in April 2020, so just when the pandemic was really starting to have an impact on working practices, nearly half of the working population was working from home, and 86% of those were doing so because of the pandemic. And when we look at our data from the 470 respondents, it mirrors that to some extent. So we found that pre-COVID, only 18% of workers were working from home regularly, and then during the pandemic, nearly 72% were. So when we look at that ONS data from April last year, and then look at that in combination with our data that we took later in the year, it certainly seems there's been a growth in home working as the pandemic went on. So that rise from, according to the ONS, 46% through to around the 72% later in kind of autumn. But I suppose overall, I think as we all know, the kind of take-home message here is that there really has been a seismic change in where people have been working from in the last 12 months. And obviously that's going to have an impact as well on what people want, and how we return from it is going to be the crucial piece in the next period of time. So one of the beauties of being able to collect data across different time periods means that we can look at how things have changed to some extent. So overall, across both our autumn and spring surveys, when we can combine that data, we see that there's just a real desire from workers to be working at home, at least some of the time going forward. So in fact, I think it was just over half, 52% of respondents had indicated that ongoing home working was extremely or very important to them, whereas no respondents had said that it was extremely or very unimportant. So it seems across the board, there really is a high degree of importance attached to home working. And that's interesting to a certain extent, but I think there's a slightly more interesting story to tell other than just people want to work from home some of the time. And that's partly to do with how things have changed across autumn and spring. And they certainly have changed. So first of all, there's been a growth of people feeling that home working is extremely important, and also a sharp increase in people citing it as being moderately important and also not important at all. But at the same time, a decrease in people saying it's very important. I think you can read that a few different ways. So one of them being that people have fallen from the metaphorical fence from onto one side or the other, and views have become more polarized. And I think when you think of the fact that before COVID, home working was seen as somewhat of a privilege, and now everyone's been doing it for a year, that kind of new and shiny feeling might well have worn off for some people, and people are going, oh, actually, I quite like the office. Or on the flip side of that, home working is everything it's cracked up to be, and it's really made my life better. So yeah, we're seeing that kind of split of people feeling more strongly either way now. So as I said, we can see there's this real drive from people to have at least some degree of working from home. But it does also kind of beg that question, well, how much of the time? Because one day a week or an afternoon a week is very different to working from home all the time. And again, when we take the data from both of our studies and combine the results, we start to get a picture of this. And we see that there's a roughly even split across kind of 1 to 5 days per week from home, with about 30% of respondents indicating each number of days. So it certainly seems at a top level, when we're looking at the combined data across the last 6 months, there's not really a magic answer of how many days most people want to work from home. It's clear that they do, but it's not necessarily clear how many days. And I think what is actually much more interesting is when we break that data down by the different cohorts of responses across time, a slightly different story starts to emerge. And again, there does seem to have been a change across that period of time. And it seems, it's become less of a polarizing issue. People have moved towards 1 to 4 days from home per week, away from 0 days and away from 5 days. So people are sitting more comfortably in that a few days from the office, a few days from home kind of space. Whereas on the flip side of that, we saw the importance of working from home to people is becoming more polarized. Certainly seems the number of days that people do want to work from home is becoming less polarized, and it's kind of converging to a certain extent. So far we've seen that people are finding regular home working more important over the last 6 months. And there's been a move away from the extremes in terms of the number of days that people want to work, so into that kind of 2 to 4 mark. But again, that all begs another question. Well, why? Why do people want to work from home? And we've asked that exact question in our studies, as well as the question on the flip side of that. What don't people like working from home? And in terms of the reasons that pull people towards it, we see money being the most cited consideration. People have been able to save a considerable amount of money through the pandemic, as they haven't been paying for lunch every day, haven't been paying for travel costs, haven't been going out for beers after work with people and paying for that. And certainly when I think of this from a personal perspective, it makes sense. So I've just bought my first house, and it wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't have been for the pandemic, as I just wouldn't have been able to have saved as much. So it certainly seems to me that financial piece does make sense. The second most cited reason is being more productive. And I suppose to a certain extent that makes sense too. There's less work-related distractions at home, less office chat, and that can all translate into some people being more productive. But I suppose the keen viewers of you might have noticed that number 4 on the dislikes about working from home is actually being less productive. So we're seeing kind of both ends of the same issue coming up. And I suppose that also makes sense. So for some people, they might not have a distraction-free environment. They might have children, pets, or they might be living in a house with five other people that are all working from home. And that combines to being a more distracting environment, which makes them less productive. Or it could be the fact that perhaps some people have less supervision whilst they're working from home, and that gives them more free rein to perhaps not be as productive as they would be in the office whilst they're sat next to their manager. We're also seeing some pragmatic considerations, like not having an hour's commute and being able to stay in bed longer. And I suppose when you look at that across the week, if someone's got an hour's commute each way to work, well, that's 10 hours a week. And for some people, that might mean more time in bed. For other people, that might mean more time with the family. But certainly home working has meant that people have been able to claw back more of their time. And when we look at the dislikes, we can see that the number 1 reason cited was that people missed social interaction. And I think it can be very easy to overlook that. So I worked out that if you work from home on a 4-day week, then I think it's 1,664 hours in a year that you would historically have been spending in face-to-face contact with people. And that's time now spent behind the desk at home on your own, which is obviously a huge change. And when you think about humans as social beings, you think, well, that's been a real step change in the last 12 months. That's probably been quite a shock to the system for a lot of people. So it's not necessarily much of a surprise that that's come in as the number 1 of things that people dislike about working from home. To a lesser extent, we also see things featuring like not getting as much development, and whether that's again from the social learning aspect of things, where you can't overhear how colleagues are working and picking up little tips of them, or whether it's more formal coaching from mentors or from managers that doesn't happen as often or as effectively whilst working from home. That's certainly something else that's been cited. Now, lower pay, there's a question around that as well. So I've heard it floated around a little bit. Can businesses get away with lower pay for home workers? And we've certainly seen articles online and murmurings from some candidates that we speak to about employers who are considering reducing pay for exclusive home working. And I suppose the logic there, the logic that we hear is that if people are working from home exclusively, then they won't have to pay for travel or other costs, and commuting time and those kind of bits cut down, and it might well mean that people are willing to take a pay cut for a home working contract. And also, when you look at that from an employer's perspective, there's a potential cost saving there of having home workers, having to pay for less office space, less overheads, and it could also be a double win if it means that businesses pay employees less as well. So there's, certainly from a business perspective, there could be huge wins there. And we thought that was all interesting questions to ask, to kind of see, even if businesses do want to do it, is there an appetite from employees, from candidates to actually take those kind of contracts? And when we first asked this question in autumn last year, it was very clear that there was very little appetite for this. So only 10% of people had said yes, and then 23% were unsure, and 67% had said no. No. And then this has shifted somewhat as time has gone on. So in spring 2021, we're now seeing 49% of people saying no, down from 67%, and a rise from 10% of people saying yes to 26%. So the proportion of people who've said they're willing to take a pay cut for an exclusive home working contract has more than doubled. And again, I do suppose that makes sense. When we look at the number of people who said that they liked the cost savings about working from home, that being the number one reason, it really does make sense that the financial implications shouldn't be overlooked from working from home. However, I suppose the other piece here is that if that's the number one drive, the number one thing that people enjoy about working from home, well, if you're then going to pay people less for doing it, then is that one of the key benefits that mean people will be willing to work from home taken away? How's that dynamic going to play out? So that's an interesting. So then job security. Of course, one of the impacts of home working is the change in the dynamic between employers and employees. Now, only back in our autumn cohort, we asked a question about whether people felt their job was more or less secure since they've been working from home. So I suppose the first really obvious thing here is that people's perception of job security isn't necessarily a reflection of working from home. In our current circumstances, the main factor is probably COVID-19 and the impact that that's had on businesses. But how managers can alleviate fears is obviously going to be impacted by the amount of contact time they can have with their staff. And what we've seen is that nearly half of respondents feel that their job has become less secure since they've been working from home. On the flip side of that, 25% have felt that their job's more secure, which is obviously nice to see. But this really does kind of highlight some of the fears that people have been having during the rise of home working that have been underlying that over the last 12 months. So it doesn't, it's certainly not all been positive. Things like saving money or feeling more productive. There seems to be an underlying fear behind everything from a significant proportion of employees that their jobs might not be as secure as they used to be. And on to employers in a little bit more detail. So back in our autumn cohort, we also asked a number of senior managers about their views of the impact of home working from an employer's perspective, and also what are employers doing in this space at the moment to alleviate some of the impact that home working has had. And also on the flip side of that, we'd also asked employees, what do they expect from their employers whilst they're working from home? What kind of support and guidance do they expect? So first of all, in terms of financial support, as employees have been working from home, there have been obvious considerations about who pays for office equipment or other consumables. So we asked our respondents what they would expect to receive whilst working from home in terms of financial support. So overwhelmingly, 48% didn't expect anything at all, which fine, fair enough. Of those who did, the main things that were cited were around tax relief and home office equipment allowance. To a lesser extent, we saw things like utilities allowance or travel allowance for when they do go into the office and as being cited. So overall, it does seem that there is some kind of expectation from employees that their employers will support them with some kinds of financial allowances. There were also a number of other types of financial support that were cited by respondents that didn't fit into the previous categories I just talked about. And that's things like one-off payments or other cash allowances. Now, when we looked through the data, there wasn't a really clear trend in what's being offered. There's really quite a wide variety of things that people had mentioned, people have said. And I think this probably highlights the range of different measures that employers have taken. But what we are seeing things like one-off payments, so we're seeing one-off equipment grant or £2,000 per year home working allowance or another £500 one-off payment. So some employers have taken the perspective, just make one cash payment and then you've looked after people to a certain extent. We're then seeing some more ongoing pieces coming through, so things like the employer paying for 20% of energy and internet bills, or just reimbursing the costs of home working, so again being able to claim back some of your bills. So there is kind of a variety there, but there certainly is a kind of prevalence of employers actually providing support to their employees. But of course, financial support isn't the be-all and end-all. There are other kinds of support too. And whether that's taken the form of home working policies or guidance about mental and physical health, there certainly is a number of things that have been offered to employees at the moment. So our survey of employers found that since the start of the pandemic, 39% had newly introduced a home working policy and 28% had amended an existing one. Now, that doesn't necessarily come as a surprise given the huge increase in home working, but I think perhaps what is a little bit more surprising is that 17% still don't have a home working policy that they use. Then in terms of the guidance that employers are providing to their employees, we found that 61% are providing information to support their employees' mental and physical health. And that has been specifically as a result of the increase in home working through the pandemic. And again, when we look at this in a little more detail, look a little bit more closely and examine the topics that employers are providing advice around, we obviously start to see the big things like mental and physical health coming through. Then we also see slightly more pragmatic considerations like IT support and tips on how to structure their working days. Now, if you remember a few slides back, we saw that the biggest dislike that people had about working from home was the lack of social interaction. Which then does make it a little surprising that only 20% of employers were organising any kind of virtual social events. So it seems like there's a bit of a gap there in terms of the biggest gripes that employees have of working from home around not having any social contacts. And then it certainly seems like employers aren't necessarily on the whole providing any support on that front or organising any social pieces. So that's probably something that could be done better in the future. So we've just seen what is being provided by employers, and we've also asked employees about what they find the most important things for them. And what we found is that it kind of marries quite well. The guidance about mental health and how to maintain a positive work-life balance are the most valued by respondents to our surveys. Now, that's interesting, but I think the really interesting bit is that when we split this down by age, we see some really clear trends. So overall, respondents who were aged between 25 and 34 are most likely to consider support in relation to mental and physical health as being very important. Now, it might well be a generational piece, or it might be that older people might be more senior, might have been in the working world longer, they might be more used to home working, so rely on those pieces less. But I certainly think there's an interesting piece there where those that are slightly younger are relying on the guidance from their employees, their employers more heavily than perhaps those that are slightly later in their careers. And as we've seen, home working does seem to be important to people, and obviously there's some expectations of employers from employees. And of course, this begs the question, how is that going to impact on hiring practices and businesses, EVPs, as we move into a world where home working is, I hate to use the phrase, the new normal. So certainly from a recruitment perspective, we look to understand what was important to candidates when looking for a new role. We found that 66% of our respondents would consider either the home working policy, home working allowances, or the guidance that an employer provides if they're working from home when they are considering a company as a prospective employer. So it certainly does seem that these elements aren't just important for current employees, but are also important in respect to attracting new talent. And I think what's going to be interesting to see in the next 6 to 12 months is, as businesses solidify their home working offering, whether it's something we start to see on job ads and start to see in benefits packages, whether there's going to be stuff specifically tailored to supporting home workers, and whether that's going to set some employers apart from others because they've given more consideration to that. So throughout this kind of bit of research, we've seen that there is a real appetite from employees to continue working from home at least some of the time in the future. We've also seen how this has changed things a bit for the employer, and whether this is, the possibility of full-time home working contracts or increased level of guidance and support, that they're expected to give out. But this change in, as I said, in inverted commas, the standard working practices is of course going to give rise to hybrid working. And that's going to have a number of other knock-on effects, both to the workplace, the worker, and also the type of work that people are carrying out. So first of all, in terms of the workplace, Reuters carried out a survey that found nearly half of the employers that they'd surveyed were planning on reducing office space as a result of the COVID-induced move towards home working. And that's obviously a huge change. But there's also likely to be a number of smaller incremental changes, things like meeting rooms that are tailored for a mix of in-person and virtual attendees, or even more hot desking. And of course, again, there's going to be some more pragmatic considerations. So things like, how are you going to make an open plan office work when you've got 30 people that are all on Zoom at the same time? Because the background noise is going to be horrendous. So do you then have to rejig how your office is structured? You're going to need more meeting rooms. Are they going to have specific technology in there to support remote workers? And as we touched on as well, a little bit, how do employers monitor their employees whilst they're working from home? Or even should they? Is this going to be a move away from some of the monitoring that's gone on in the past? I certainly know from speaking to some of our clients that they found that certain sections of their workforce have actually been more productive whilst they've been working from home, and they've been less under the microscope about what they're doing. So is that going to have an impact? And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. And then again, when we look at this from the perspective of work and the worker in the same way, we see things like the ability to source remote talent coming through. So if employees are on a remote contract, then they can be hired from any location. Certainly we've worked with clients that are in quite remote parts of the UK where there's a skills shortage, and being able to have complete remote work contracts means that you can then start hiring people from talent hotspots across the country. So really opening up those talent pools. And equally, we're having conversations with some of our clients about diversity, and for some businesses that are based in, again, quite remote locations where 98% of the population in that location is white and working class or whatever, then their opportunity to hire a diverse workforce is a lot less than those in some of the greater population centres. So for those businesses, again, being able to hire people from population centres means that they can open up new elements of diversity to their workforce. Or even the ability to have flexible working hours might mean that skilled professionals who have other responsibilities like childcare may now be accessible to businesses because of the flexibility that home working and flexible hours give. So again, I think overall, home working and exclusive home working contracts, from a business's point of view, really does open up the opportunity of accessing talent that they haven't been able to in the past. And then on the flip side of that kind of employee life cycle, in the perspective of retention, this is all probably going to have quite a big impact on retention strategies as well. As things have historically been, people have been tied to the businesses they work for, partly due to relationships they have in person with people, partly due to location and convenience. Well, if people are working from home, then they've also got a much broader market of employers to choose from. So there's going to be quite an interesting dynamic and change in the recruitment landscape and the retention landscape over the next kind of 6 to 12 months. And as I touched on a couple of slides ago, there's been an increase in working from home, and that's obviously changed the manager-employee dynamic massively as the amount of face time has decreased. I suppose one of the ways that we're hearing about businesses reconciling that is by measuring what employees are doing more and measuring their output more. And what we found is that 56% of our respondents had said they were having their productivity measured, whilst only 44% said they weren't, which again is interesting in itself, but not necessarily that meaningful. What I think perhaps is more interesting is that of those that had said yes, 82% earn less than £30,000 a year. So that certainly suggests that productivity monitoring is more prevalent in lower paid roles. And it also begs the question a little bit, how are employers measuring productivity in their workforce? And again, that's an exact question that we asked in one of our surveys. And to be honest, there was a range of answers, none of them that groundbreaking. So we heard a lot of things about just normal KPIs, things like time on the phone, or the number of calls made in a day for telephony-based businesses. And then we've seen a lot of other businesses introducing workload trackers, so it's a little bit more monitoring on that front. But we didn't really see anything revolutionary in there. It was mainly just standard tools that were perhaps already being used, but might not have been used as widely or relied upon so much historically. And then finally, as we look to the future, as we look to coming back from the home working piece and again, use that phrase, the new normal, a lot of people have spoken about if they are getting asked to go back to the office, well, how do they feel about workplace COVID testing? Obviously, the government's been offering lateral flow tests to everyone over the past month or so. I think even before then, it was possible for employers to order them to their staff so they could take them before they came into the office or their usual place of work. So we wanted to understand if workplace testing was A, kind of being widely offered, and B, how it was being perceived by employees. So firstly, we found that only a quarter of employees had been offered workplace testing by their employers, whereas just over double that amount, 53%, had said they would feel more comfortable returning to their normal place of work if they were offered a test. So it really does seem to be some kind of gap there between what employees want and what employers are delivering. And for some businesses, and as COVID reduces, it might not actually necessarily reduce the risk that much by getting tested. However, just that perception for employees to make people more comfortable coming back to the workplace, that might be the important kind of outcome of workplace testing. Again, food for thought there. So coming to the end now. So in terms of a summary of what we found. So first of all, there's a high level of demand for longer term home working. That seems pretty clear. And mostly people are looking for a bit of a split in between time in the office and time working from home. And that's kind of somewhere in between the 2 to 4 days per week. In terms of the benefits to workers, the saving money seems to be the clear #1 thing that's been cited. And on the flip side of that, the main downside has been people not being able to mix with other humans on a day-to-day basis and not having that social interaction. There's also seems to be a trend that working from home makes people feel that their job is less secure. Employers are also exploring reducing salaries, and some have introduced home working financial allowances as well. In terms of support to employees, mental health and physical health advice is being provided by most employers to their employees, and that's also something that really is valued by employees, particularly in the age group of 25 to 34. We're also seeing an investment in a wide range of technologies to support and monitor workers who might be working from home. And finally, home working will increase the availability of niche skills as businesses access previously untapped talent pools, and just more broadly, the opportunities for businesses to leverage remote workers and access individuals and skilled talent pools that perhaps weren't accessible previously, whilst they were only recruiting people in office working environments. So, on to questions. So, no questions so far, so I'll just hand it back over to Mark for a final outro.
Thank you, Rory. Yeah, if there's any questions that anybody's got, just click on the function. Happy for you to reflect and send those through. We will be sending the slides out to you off the back of this session anyway, so there'll be a chance for you to kind of digest all of this data and all this insight and think about what it might mean and if there's any further interpretation needed. As Rory said at the start of his presentation, we are currently conducting analysis of some of the segments within here. So we're trying to understand some underlying trends, whether it be by age, by gender, or maybe by salary level. These will feature in the white paper, which will be sent out to you within the next 2 weeks. As attendees of this session, you will get that before we market it to anybody else. And again, feedback upon that will be really useful. What I hope that you've seen from this is that there is clearly a shift in certain areas, and it's interesting really just to reflect on that around how we feel as well. Are we keen to return, and are we looking for balance? It certainly resonates with a lot of the conversations I've had with HR people lately. So I think that in moving this forward, it's great to get your feedback. We will drill into the detail. This session will be available as well on a recorded platform, so if you'd like to listen back, you can, and share with others, that's fine as well. Finally, if insights and white papers and data is your thing, please visit cogitoinsights.com and click on the I Think Hub link at the very bottom of the page. That's where all of our library of papers, studies and previous events sit. So that brings this webinar to a close. Thank you for joining. I hope it's been useful to you. We've seen some comments coming through, so we know people have been making notes and they're looking to put some of this into practice. I hope you all have a great day, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Goodbye.